One of the risks of turning your hobby into a side hustle is that you lose time for your actual hobby. The past few months for the Fixit Fingers workshop have been incredibly hectic, and most of that has been handyman jobs because, quite frankly, they pay a lot more than YouTube videos, and I've been struggling to find the time to work on something just for me. I'd say it's time to rectify that, but honestly, I have been rectifying that for the past 11 months. Because that's when this project actually started. You see, apart from being a bit of a wood nerd, and just a general all-round nerd, I am also a D&D nerd. That's right, Dungeons and Dragons. And of course, like all of my hobbies, I had to monetize it as a professional dungeon master for hire on my other side hustle, Zalgariath Gaming. But I'm going to call this one a hobby build because honestly, it's mostly for myself. And that's why it's taken 11 months for me to get around to finishing this thing. I've been working on it in spits and spurts, on and off, in between sponsorship deals, handyman jobs, looking after the building as the building manager here, and life stuff. Which is a shame, because the past week where I've really knuckled down to finish this thing, I have had so much fun, and it's just been a joy to build something purely and utterly for myself, which has really not much function, but gives me an excuse to play with all the toys and perhaps acquire a few new ones along the way. So, anyone familiar with Dungeons & Dragons will probably know that it mostly revolves around making stuff up and dice. And what I really wanted to make for myself was a sexy ass, custom, one-of-a-kind, completely unique, over-engineered and ridiculous dice tower. And while I was making one, I thought, I'm making this up on the go, we better make two of them so I can kind of practice on the first one and then replicate those steps on the second one. Makes sense, yeah? But of course also then nearly doubles the work involved. Absolutely no plan here. I am flying by the seat of my pants the whole way. No sketches, no measurements. The only thing I had as reference were the dice, which you will see me test about 27,000 times over the course of this build to make sure at each stage they will navigate the mechanism which I came up with, as convoluted as it is. Now, like most things, you can of course just buy dice towers incredibly cheaply all over the internet. 3D printing has given some incredibly affordable and awesome options, but, well, I don't have a 3D printer, and where's the fun in that? I don't want to buy someone else's design. I want a tower, and I want a spiral staircase in my tower, and I want to spend an awful lot of time making said spiral staircase, despite the fact that I'm pretty sure you're never going to be able to see it once this is all finished. So things started off well. I had the mechanism in my head first, and what I wanted was a plywood tower, really stretching the capabilities of my baby drill press to cut out some massive holes from a bunch of pieces of plywood, and then, as we said, the spiral staircase, which will go tinker, 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 and make a lovely, beautiful sound for the dice to roll down before spitting them out at the bottom. I'll also point out I started this so long ago, it was before I had my table saw, so we had to work around that fact. And I also wanted to use a lot of hand tools, but that was going to be for the pretty bits. The functional section, it was just about getting it done with whatever I had on hand. And it was really handy to make two of these. Often you do something one way and get a bit of a janky result, and then figure out a better way to do it the second time around. It also gave me a chance to use huge amounts of offcuts and scraps, and you know what? Thinking back on this, every single piece of timber going into this build is an offcut. So while I didn't intend it, this is actually going to be my official entry to Dainer Made's Offcuts Only 23 Challenge, because the other official entry, which I have in mind to come up next, really isn't going to be finished by the deadline. Check out the hashtag to see all of the entries to that lovely little competition. Alrighty, that's enough story time. Let's get into some of the actual build details in this woodworking project. What you've seen me do so far, flowing along in the background, is cut out a bunch of plywood pieces using chopper kris, because I did not yet have my table saw, drill some giant holes in them to make the tower, and then manufacturing the spiral staircases from a bunch of thin offcuts and a bamboo skewer, plus a whole stack load of super glue, tacking it together with Hey Presto the nail gun, and utilising numerous little one-off jigs, plus some of the more permanent ones which hang around in the workshop for tasks such as these. Honestly, when you're doing as much repetitive work as this build takes, and because I'm making two of them, jigs are your best friend. The time it took to come up with some of those hacks saved me many multiples of their construction in eliminating repetitive processes, like measuring and marking. Once the tower and stairs were made, I quickly needed to make an exit hole down the bottom for the dice to come out of, and then it was time for the first testing. Things went well, except for the big chunky boy dice. Those D20s were too fat to get down the spiral. So we started to shave things away, and then I remembered that I have power tools. And while I am trying to do as much of this as possible using hand tools, sometimes installing a drum on your drill press is a much better way than hacking at it with a hand file. Nothing in there needs to look pretty, it's all going to be hidden after all. Right, with those major components constructed, Presto comes out again and we start assembly. Well, the first assembly anyway. There is a lot of assembly going on in this build. It has to be said that working without a plan definitely takes a lot longer. It's probably more fun because you're not worrying about following step-by-step guides and you can jump between different stages constantly. But if you're trying to do this efficiently, then I highly recommend having a plan. There were so many little things which I just simply hadn't thought of, which tripped me up and set me back numerous occasions over this build, like the D20 not fitting. But here, we have success. Look at that happy dance. Thanks, Ainslee. Stolen from Small Fry. There we go, proof of concept that the spiral staircase design will work, so we can start tacking that down now. It looks ugly as sin right now, but it'll all be covered up with a pretty wooden skin afterwards. So this is pretty much stage 1 of the build done. With 427 more tests successfully completed, I could finally glue it all together, clamp it overnight, break out Kevin the random orbital sander, get rid of any wobbles with a few more Presto tack guns, and already I'd spent more time on the carcass than I thought the entire build would take. But at least my mechanisms were done, and knowing that this was going to be hidden later on, I decided to spray in some of the black now, just to deaden the inside so that when the nice skin goes over the top, you don't see the janky bits in the middle. And that's where we left things for, I'm going to say weeks, it was probably more like months. And it's also where I decided to leave the majority of the power tools behind. I've got some lovely hand tools, and I really wanted to practice using them on a project that didn't matter. It's only for myself, so perfection was not the goal here. It was getting familiar with some of my new purchases, like my hand planes, and teaching myself a few new skills like sawing straight-ish. And to do that, we're going to make the turrets on the corner of those towers. And time to break out some nice wood. These pieces of Australian cedar have come off a window which we tore out of the building. And the lighter coloured ones are Oregon, and this will differentiate the two towers. There's going to be one that's all cedar pretty much, and one that's two-tone with the Oregon, Douglas fir, and the cedar. That way I can decide which one I like the best. So I cut everything to size, routed out some channels, and then glued the turrets into position. The gluing process did leave me with a bit of a wobble, so we put some sandpaper down on the bench and got rid of that nice and quick. And then it was time to, break out the first new purchase, bought specifically for this project because I wanted some spoke shaves. Melbourne Tool Company released some sexy spoke shaves in the meantime. I enjoyed my planes, which I got from them a few months ago, so I decided to really break it out and give these things a go. They were great fun. I'm sure there are other ways you could do this a lot faster and easier, but there is something very enjoyable about spending some quiet time in your shop with the shaving sound of the hand tools. And cedar is just very forgiving. It's super soft, it molds like butter. and it looks fantastic. That was great fun. And that's why we're here, isn't it? Yeah, we're trying to be functional, but enjoying the process. That's what the woodworking's all about. However, after all of that time with the hand tools, sometimes you just want to get things done, and it was time to chamfer all the things on the Oregon. I did try very briefly to use the spoke shave on here, but the Oregon is very brittle and splintery, so we resorted back to the router table to put some giant chamfers on the side. These are going to be towers, so what would towers be without some bricks and mortar? I didn't want to go over the top with the embellishments. I wanted the wood to be the primary feature, along with something else coming up later. But this step gave me another excuse to break out a different set of hand tools, my little carving chisels. Gave them a quick sharpen, and then set to carving out the mortar pattern. This was a bit tricky in the Oregon, again, because it was so brittle and splintery. Getting across the grain particularly was challenging. But we got there in the end, and it was certainly worth the time investing into that detail. We'll highlight it later. Alright, that's the turrets done for now. Let's get some cladding going. So the eagle-eyed among you will now notice the sporty new haircut, which indicates yet another significant passage of time passing between working on this project. And also the sexy new apron from Carbotech. Didn't pay for this one, it was a gift as I am an ongoing affiliate for them. Not sure if I am an apron guy, but yeah, you know, when you got the hand tools, it makes you feel like a real woodworker. Over at the Barber's Paddock trimmer, we got our big chunk of cedar, which still had an embedded nail in it, thank God for carbide blades. We tidied it off, and we are still in pre-table saw times, so required Chopper Chris and my ripping jig once more to clean off one edge, before using a combo of the power plane and the hand plane to straighten up the opposite face. Once more, I just really like working with cedar. It makes the crappiest hand tool woodworker novice look like they almost know what they're doing. Could do with a bit more of a skew angle on that number 5 jack plane though. However, we were having fun, and that was almost kind of square. You know, if you check square enough times and tell people you're checking square, they'll believe you that it's square because they can't see whether it is or not. Nah, it was square enough for me. So I hacked that long length into 3 separate pieces, which I would then need to resaw to give me the walls of the dice towers. And because I was so nervous, I thought I would stick a little bit of a cutting guide down onto the edge. I have never resawn something with a hand tool before. In fact, I don't think I've really resawn anything because I don't have a bandsaw and I don't have a thicknesser. This is going to be interesting. If I get it right, from these 3 chunks, I'll get 9 sides, which gives me 1 extra to skin the dice towers with. Very exciting to try something new, but also quietly shit myself. Let's see how we go. So I started off very tentatively, and then eventually as I gained confidence and followed my little edge guide, we got slightly more aggressive. The Kreg vise does work well, though is probably not ideal for this particular instance, nor is my clamping bench, which was designed for power tools and doesn't really have the weight to counter the wobbles of the hand tools as it sits on casters. Hey! That took a long time. That's 1 of 6 cuts. I want a bandsaw. But after some sweating and swearing, the first piece was off. And honestly, it wasn't that bad. You can see my little guides there. They worked quite well to keep me on the straight and narrow. So much so that the confidence boost let me remove them for the next cut, and I decided to time it to see how quickly I could get this done. What I didn't decide to do was keep a close eye on my jack plane almost wobbling off the table, and that would have been disastrous if it had hit the ground. But just after 7 minutes, I had 3 pieces of timber, and soon after that I had hacked through all the required bits. Not gonna lie, it was a challenge and I wish I didn't have to do it with the handsaw, but it was a skill building experience. While I may not have found that terribly fun, I do enjoy a good old planing. The cedar is so soft, using the power plane would have been complete overkill, so it was back to the low angle jack plane to clean off those saw marks, which honestly you'd have to do on a bandsaw anyway. The outside faces had some old paint on there, so we got the former strippers out to take off that side. And yet one more round of jack plane low angle goodness to turn this horrid mess into beautiful, shiny, reflective, straight off the plane goodness that barely needs sanding. Look at that. Now we can give it a final barber's trim and the fine adjustments with the little block plane to give me the blanks for the sides. The important one obviously is the front where the dice need to spit out. So I made a test template out of MDF and then used that to transfer the mark over onto the two that needed the openings in them and drill those out with a large Forstner bit over on the drill press. Cheeky little round over to smooth off those edges. And it was time for the second round of embellishments. And yet more saw practice. The best kind of practice, the ones that doesn't involve joinery. Those kind of looks like box joints, but they didn't have to fit together. You computer game nerds may know these as Crenellations. That's the only reason I learnt about them. Basically those staggered blocks on top of a castle that the archers used to hide behind. And a nice little different detail for the front wall as well. One problem with the cedar being so soft is, even with a very sharp chisel, you do tend to tear at the wood rather than slice through it, particularly getting across the end grain here. And that left me with a few ugly gaps, which will come back to bite me later. For the side walls, because they were all the same, I could gang them up, clamp them up, and then hack out those pieces as well. I could have set up the router table for this, but honestly, I was challenging myself to use hand tools, and this was an obvious task. One day, when I'm practicing joinery, this bit of practice might come in handy. As I broke out the baby files for the fine details, the heavens decided to open, and jeebers did she rain that day. I had to pull out the drain, which had clogged up with leaves, to stop Noah's flood from coming into the workshop. It was torrential. There's that ugly hacky Terry, and while the wet putty looked really good, it was one of the least satisfying bits at the end of the build because it just didn't look the same as the cedar after it had dried. It was a bit chalky. Here is the stage progression of the big statement piece for this build. I am going to be doing me some resin. Along the side panels, I just drew out some random geometric lines, which happened to be the exact width of one of my router bits. And figuring out a clever clamping setup, using the Kreg straight edge guide track, and a spacer block, I was able to do some really cool looking designs, each of them unique, on each face of the dice towers. I even risked coming out the top at the end grain, even though that was going to be challenging to dam up later when it came to adding the resin. I wasn't going to hand carve these bits. But I was going to hand carve my Zalgariath gaming logo on the front. So breaking out Stabby McStabface from my good mate Dazza, I firstly used that Sharpie knife to carve in the design that I wanted from my ZG logo, and then broke out the Japanese carving chisels and the regular chisels to slowly and painfully hack away at the cedar, trying to keep it as neat as possible. No CNC in the Fixit Fingers workshop just yet, And you know what? I don't care. I enjoy this kind of thing. I do it fairly regularly. But it does take an awful long time, so for version 2 I decided to plug in the Dremel and take a slightly different approach. The Fixit Fingers handheld CNC. HMC? HNC. Human numerical control? HTC. Human tool control. Yeah, that works. Could only do so much with the tiny little router bit though. Needed to use the chisel to clean up those edges. And put in the little star points with the drill press to finish off my carving. Came out not bad. Whenever I do this inlay resin work, I like to break out the Feast Watson grain filling sanding sealer, because it helps stop coloured resin in particular from flowing along the open grains, and this cedar had very open grains. Honestly, I probably should have done 2 or 3 coats, not the 1 coat that I did. I've got a really good video on why this step is important to get sharp lines with your resin work. I'll link that above. Blue tape would be my damming material for the majority of this, and these silicone trays are really cool and handy. You can find them on the baking section in Amazon, and they really help contain any spills, but fortunately, on this build, I did not have any. While stirring up my resin, I was listening to Tomes and Tales RPG.
Isn't that thing where it's like you try to blame the gun for your error?
No, she knows it's her. She's just, because like she only got it not that long ago. This is like sort of her first time really using it, so I'm just going to fob it off that she's not used to it yet.
For sure. Anything else you would like to do?
I don't think there is much that I can do. Let me just quickly check. Yeah.
This is an all-Australian D&D live play podcast. I've been listening to Cody the Gang for quite a while now, through their previous of Dice and Magic and now onto their current undertakings in a gothic horror grimdark scenario of fantasy type. Go check out their YouTube channel if you are into the nerdy D&D type stuff. It's an enjoyable character-driven experience with a little bit of combat thrown in as well, and helps to break up the woodworking podcast that I usually have on in the background. I have been enjoying it a lot. And did I mention there were a number of large breaks? Resin takes a couple of days to cure. I think this sat here for 7 weeks, as things just got super hectic again. But from this point forward, I'd cleared my schedule, I'd finished all of my commitments and videos for other people, and so I decided with my next available days, the dice towers would get done. Starting with some flattening. My well and truly cured resin could come over to my janky little router sled. Because they're so small, double-sided tape I found was the best method of attaching them down to the base. And I could break out my surfacing bit and just take off ever so slightly enough. I'd measured out my resin pretty perfectly using the rice trick, so there was very little left over, and I hadn't overfilled it too much. So you can see here a nice angle of just taking off a mil or 2 at the top. But that does leave some tram lines. So fortunately, the double-sided tape also allowed me to get Kevin the Sander in to take away those marks, before progressing through 240, 320, 400, 600, 800 and 1000 grit sandpaper to prepare these for polish so that resin would shine. The blue was a lovely choice against the red cedar, came out looking really nice. You'll see it pop in a second, but first, a cheeky little trick, which I'm not going to explain too much. I'll leave you guessing why I am putting some near-medium rare earth magnets into the front there. We'll come back to that at the end. Breaking out my favourite finish, Scotty's Custom Grit, Step 1 and Step 2. I used the 2 different sanding pads which I picked up from Hammaroo. Those big foam boys allow me to get some super sexy shine into the resin. And the wood too, really. You can just use this as a finish, but I will be putting a finish over the top. Danish oil, most likely, right at the end. This is all about buffing up that plastic bits. Step 2 goes on to some redonkulous 50,000 grit or something along those lines. And only takes a few seconds to get a glass-like mirror shine on the front of those. Look at that. Never ceases to be amazing custom grit. I'll link him down below. It's great stuff. Hashtag not sponsored for that one. Oh, we're just pegging all the products now, aren't we? Those stop-loss bags are another one of my favourite things. In there I've got some Jarrah-coloured stain and varnish, which I'm just going to pick out the brick mortar work to try and get it to pop a little. Sadly, it got slightly lost on the cedar because it ended up being a very similar colour once the finish went on right at the end, but on the Oregon it worked particularly well. And that was the sidewalls pretty much done. But I still had a top plate I needed to do, and just a reminder to wear your mask when doing this sort of stuff. The router sled kicks up a crud load of very fine dust, and my air monitor there was absolutely screaming at me. It only takes a few minutes to die down. Open the garage door and most of that dust will clear quickly, so the air monitor is a great thing to have because it tells you when it's safe to take your mask off again. Those top panels I'd run out of cedar, so they were Meranti offcuts from a very early project. They'd been sitting around for a long time. And of course, if they're sitting on the top, they need a hole in them. So again, I made a very janky looking template out of MDF so that I could cut the smallest hole possible in the Meranti topper to still fit the chonky boy dice through. It'll fit on like that, and I could trace it out so I could get most of the bulk hacked away at the drill press. Then we double side tape the jig down to the topper and pop over to the router table. This is all pretty much end grain just by the orientation that I chose and was a little bit sketchy. But taking my time, we got a very nice clean hole, which I then got a large chamfer bit and put a 45 around the outside to sort of guide the dice down and just look that little bit schmicker too. More magnets going in the top of the topper for unknown reasons, before gluing it down to the dice tower. Time to glue on the sides, front and back. Break out the Dainer super spreader and stick those down nicely. One of the other really good things about the custom grit is here, after a bit more testing, of course, just testing, always testing. What was I saying? Oh yeah. One of the best things about Scotty's custom grit is here I'm putting the clamps on. I've got nothing underneath them. Yes, they will scratch it up a little bit, but you can just come back with another touch-up, and anywhere the clamp pad's rubbed away some of that finish, you just put it straight on back over the top. Very, very easy, very repairable. And after many, many long months, we were just about done. I chose to use Danish oil as the final finish over the top. It's going to get 4 or 5 coats eventually because it's just so damn easy, you can't over-apply it, you wipe it off 10 minutes later, and apart from waiting in between coats, it is the simplest finish that I know how to use. A bit of wax polish to get it smelling good apart from anything else. And my beautiful dice towers are ready for their first game of Dungeons and Dragons. But wait, what's that? There are some dice trays! Where did they come from? Well, this video's already far too long, so you're going to have to tune in next week to find out how exactly I made those. But yes, we are going to have dice trays to stop the damn things from running off the table. So click that subscribe button. I can't promise too many more nerdy builds like this, but where hobbies collide, they do tend to happen from time to time. I swear I got that first time. I might make me a gaming table if I ever get super adventurous, but for now, thanks for watching what is, I believe, my longest ever woodworking build video, but then again, it was 11 months in the making, so good things come to those who wait. And in this case, that person is me. I have dice towers, but not for long. I'm going to be giving away the second one, once I decide which one the second one is. I think I like the Oregon. Thanks everyone for watching. This is James from Fixit Fingers. I hope you've enjoyed this extended ramble of nerdy, woody D&D dice towery goodness. I'll catch you on the next one.